there is a version of Donovan Bailey the world never fully saw. Not the bravado. Not the outspoken bluntness that made every press conference feel like the opening round of a fight that the track had not yet been scheduled to finish. Not the world record at 9:84 seconds in Atlanta that made him the fastest human alive, and gave Canada something the country had been searching for since the Ben Johnson scandal had taken the previous version of that title and replaced it with shame. There is a version that existed beneath all of it, in the preparation that the trash talk was specifically designed to protect. In the training sessions where the body was asked to produce what the mouth had already promised the world it would deliver. In the quiet moments when the names of the men who could end everything arrived in the mind before the starting gun had even been loaded. At 58, far enough from the track to say it without the competition shaping the words, Bailey named 5 runners who made that version of him necessary. Every world title he collected, every world record he set, every finish line he crossed with the specific authority of a man who had decided, before anyone else had fully agreed, that he was the fastest human on the planet. All of it was shaped by the men who forced him to become more than the bravado suggested. At 58, he finally said their names. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same hatred, 5 men he genuinely could not stand to race. Number 5, Frankie Fredericks. The Namibian who arrived at every finish line close enough to make the gold feel like a negotiation rather than a certainty. Frankie Fredericks of Namibia was the man the sport had identified as the favourite going into the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. Not Bailey. Not the defending world champion who had won the 100 metres at the 1995 World Championships in Gothenburg, and had spent the year building toward Atlanta with the specific focus of a man who had already decided what the result was going to be. Fredericks, the elegant Namibian who had run 9:86 seconds at Lausanne and 9.87 seconds at Helsinki in the Olympic year, times that placed him at the front of every pre-race conversation about who Atlanta was going to belong to. Bailey had torn all 3 adductor muscles in his left thigh 17 days before the Atlanta final. The injury happened in Nice, at 95 metres of a race he was winning, and the recovery that followed was the kind that coaches describe in terms of what they hope, rather than what they expect. His coach Dan Pfaff said the first thought was whether they could get Bailey to run at least the first round of 4. Not win. Run. That was the opening position of the preparation for the race that Bailey had identified as the destination of everything. And then Atlanta arrived, and Fredericks ran 9.89 seconds, and Bailey ran 9.84, the world record, the gold. The result that the pre-race conversation had assigned to the Namibian went instead to the Canadian who had spent the previous 10 days in a physiotherapy room being reassembled by a chiropractor, working against a timeline that the injury had not cooperated with. Bailey said what Fredericks gave him was the hatred of a rival whose presence as the pre-race favourite had made the gold feel conditional rather than inevitable. Most rivals at the highest level of the event produce times that the preparation can account for and build a response to. Fredericks produced times that made the sport's collective assessment of who Atlanta belonged to go somewhere other than Bailey. And the specific hatred of racing someone whose name the world has placed on your destination, whose existence makes your goal feel like a contest rather than a confirmation, is a hatred that the result alone does not fully discharge. The gold had been won, but the winning had required something that the favouritism assigned to Fredericks had made necessary to find. Number 4. Linford Christie, the defending Olympic champion who treated Bailey's arrival as an inconvenience rather than a succession. Linford Christie of Great Britain won the Olympic 100-metre gold at the 1992 Barcelona Games at 32 years old, the oldest man in history to win the event at that point. He carried that title with the specific intensity of a man who had spent his entire career being told he was too old, too slow, too late, to everything, and had converted each dismissal into fuel for a preparation that the dismissals had not anticipated. Christie was not simply a champion. He was a champion who had decided that the title, once taken, was his to keep until someone produced a result on the biggest stage available that was good enough to take it. Bailey was 27 when Atlanta arrived. Christie was 36. The specific dynamic of a young champion arriving to displace an older one who has not finished believing the title belongs to him is a dynamic that produces a specific kind of antagonism. Not the clean competitive hatred of two men at similar stages, but the more complicated hatred of a succession that one side is ready for and the other has not agreed to. Christie false started twice in the Atlanta final. The second false start was controversial. The timing system detecting a reaction of 0.086 seconds, a margin Christie disputed. He was disqualified. He refused to leave the track immediately, stood at the edge, watched the race that had been taken from him by the starting gun rather than by anyone in the field. And then Bailey ran 9.84 and the succession the career had been building toward was completed in a race that Christie had not been permitted to finish. Bailey said what Christie gave him was the hatred of a predecessor who had not finished the job of being replaced. Most champions who are displaced by younger rivals accept the timeline that results establish. Christie competed against the timeline itself, against the assumption that his position at the front of global sprinting was a settled matter rather than an ongoing argument. And the specific discomfort of a rival whose disqualification in the defining race produced no resolution, who left the Atlanta track without having been beaten, only removed, is a discomfort that victory alone could not fully address. The succession had happened. Christie had not agreed to it. Number 3. Maurice Greene, the American who took his world record and made the taking personal. Maurice Greene of the United States ran 90.79 seconds in Athens in 1999 and became the new world record holder. Bailey had set the record in Atlanta in 1996. 9.84 seconds, the fastest anyone had run in history at that moment. The record was not simply a number in the books. It was the specific evidence of what the Atlanta night had produced, the validation of everything the career had promised, and the thing that made the fastest man in the world not just a title but a fact that the sport had confirmed through its most reliable instrument. Greene took that fact, in Athens, in a race Bailey was not present for, and then, at the 1997 World Championships, Greene had beaten Bailey and poked his tongue out in celebration. The specific celebration of a man who had identified Bailey as the standard and was communicating, in the most public forum available, that the standard had been updated. Bailey said it directly. Greene was dirty. That across the 20 years since Atlanta, only 2 clean athletes had won the Olympic 100 metres. Himself and Usain Bolt. He said he competed against guys who clearly were cheating, but he beat them all. That was the best freedom you could have in any sport, beating someone who was dirty. You could look in their eyes and see they were searching for something they were never going to find. The world record that Greene took from Bailey in 1999 was not simply a result. It was the specific instrument through which the sport determined who the era's fastest man was. And the hatred of a man who takes that instrument, who arrives at a number you built and replaces your name with his own, is a hatred that the subsequent years of distance could not fully reduce to something more manageable. At 58, Bailey said the tongue-out celebration from Athens 1997 was the specific image that had stayed longest. Not because it was the most significant result, because it was the most deliberate communication of what Greene intended. Number 2. Linford Christie. Part 2. Ben Johnson. The shadow that followed Bailey from the moment he became Canada's fastest man, and the name that made his gold mean something different in his own country than it meant anywhere else. Ben Johnson of Canada won the Olympic 100-metre gold in Seoul in 1988, 9.79 seconds, the fastest time in history, and then the drug test came back positive, and everything the result had meant, to Canada, to Johnson personally, to the sport's entire understanding of what was possible, was taken and replaced with something that the country spent the following 8 years trying to process. Bailey had watched the race in a Toronto bar with friends. Johnson was a hero, an inspiration, the proof that a Jamaican-born Canadian could be the fastest human alive. And then the test result arrived, and the proof became evidence of something different entirely. When Bailey won in Atlanta, the shadow of Seoul arrived with the gold medal. He said it directly before the race. He was not trying to undo what Ben did in Seoul. His name was Donovan Bailey. No matter what happened in history, because it was such a huge story, it was always going to come up. The comparison was not one he had sought. It was the comparison that the country had decided to make because it was the only previous reference point available for what Bailey had just produced. Bailey said what Johnson's legacy gave him was the most complicated hatred of the five. Not the hatred of a rival who beat him or who took something from him in competition. The hatred of a context that had been placed around his achievement before the achievement had finished being made, of being the answer to a question that Johnson's failure had created, the proof that the country's sprint legacy could be rebuilt, and of understanding that every gold medal, every world record, every finish line crossed, first would be measured against Seoul in the way that corrections are always measured against the error they are correcting. That is a specific category of hatred, not of a man, of a narrative that a man's actions had made unavoidable. Bailey had not chosen to be the correction. The correction had chosen him. And the hatred of carrying something you did not sign up for, of having your greatest achievement permanently framed by someone else's greatest failure, is a hatred that the gold medals and the world records and the passage of 30 years had not fully resolved. Number 1. Michael Johnson. The man he called a chicken, on live television, into the camera, with the specific satisfaction of someone who had already decided that the word was accurate and the audience was large enough to justify saying it. Michael Johnson of the United States won the Olympic 200-metre and 400-metre golds at the 1996 Atlanta Games. In the same stadium, in the same week, at the same games where Bailey won the 100-metre gold and the world record. 2 champions, same stage, different events. And the specific friction of 2 men who both believed they were the defining athlete of those games, who both had the results to support the belief, produced a rivalry that the Atlanta track had not been long enough to settle. The argument started almost immediately. By the end of August 1996, Bailey and Johnson were in a shouting match at a Berlin meeting. The trash talk escalated across months. Johnson questioned Bailey's character publicly, said Bailey had trained in the United States under an American coach and then called the American public ignorant. Bailey called Johnson a fraud, said there was no rivalry because every time they had raced in the same event, Bailey had won. The first time they clashed, in 1994, Bailey beat Johnson. The 150-metre match race at Toronto's Sky Dome in June 1997 was the stage the argument had been building toward for a year. 150 metres, a distance that Bailey said was his from the start, a distance that Johnson said was his because of the 200-metre endurance it required, a distance that existed specifically because neither man had been willing to agree on who was right. Bailey established a lead coming around the bend. Johnson grabbed his thigh at 110 metres and hobbled to a stop. The race was over, and Bailey, running through the line in 14.99 seconds, turned to the camera while he was still slowing down and said what he had been building toward for the entire rivalry. He didn't pull up at all. He's just a chicken. He's afraid to lose. I think what he should do, we should run this race over again so I can kick his ass one more time. 3 decades later, there was still no relationship between them. Bailey said Johnson had blocked his involvement in a track venture in 2025, said Johnson had kiboshed his prospects of getting involved. The specific personal nature of an antagonism that had survived 30 years of retirement communicated everything about what the rivalry had always actually been. Bailey said what Johnson gave him was the hatred that produced the most honest version of who he was on a track. Not the hatred of someone who beat him. Johnson had not beaten him in any of the races that mattered. The hatred of a rival who made the competition personal before it had happened, who turned a professional argument about speed and distance into something that the track alone was never large enough to contain. The chicken comment, the shouting match in Berlin, the 150-metre race that Johnson stopped running in rather than lose. All of it was evidence of what Johnson had produced in Bailey, a competitive fire so specific and so directed that 30 years of retirement had not reduced it to something easier to carry. At 58, Bailey said Johnson's name was the one that produced the strongest reaction, not because the results had gone badly, because the results had gone so completely in his favour, and Johnson had still not accepted them. That, Bailey said, was the most honest definition of hatred. When the winning is not enough to end it. At 58, Donovan Bailey had nothing left to manage. The world record from Atlanta was in the books, even if Greene's 9.79 in 1999 had superseded it. The 2 Olympic golds, the 100 metres and the 4x100 relay were permanent. The 1995 World Championship title that had announced the career to the global stage was part of the historical record. The career that had begun as a stockbroker who ran in his spare time and had rebuilt itself into the fastest human alive had been completed in a way that the sport had not fully anticipated when it began. What he had, at 58, was honesty. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same hatred. Frankie Fredericks gave him the hatred of a rival whose pre-race favouritism made the gold feel conditional. Linford Christie gave him the hatred of a predecessor who had not agreed to be replaced. Maurice Greene gave him the hatred of a man who took his world record and celebrated the taking personally. Ben Johnson gave him the hatred of a context he had not chosen. And Michael Johnson gave him the hatred that 30 years of winning had not been enough to end. The world heard the trash talk, the bluntness, the chicken comment delivered into a television camera at full running speed. What the world did not always see was the 5 names that made the bluntness necessary. At 58, he finally said them out loud.